Hello friends, Rob Caskie, engaging storytelling. I hope very much that you've enjoyed my March stories. March is a tricky month, having 5 Wednesdays, and we have agreed that we're going to do 4 stories a month. So I hope very much that you will excuse my not providing a story for the last Wednesday in March. I've grown a lockdown overcoat, as you can see, especially since this month and next we're going to be speaking about the Anglo-Boer War. The Boers were almost exclusively bearded in this campaign. And isn't it wonderful to consider that in the Magaliesberg Mountains, there's a place called Skeerpoort, which is basically Shaving Valley, where the Boers on their way to Pretoria to meet with Kruger in the early phases of the Boer War would stop to clean up and often have a shave on the banks of that little stream, hence the name Skeerpoort. Now I'm particularly interested in cutlery and knives. Nepal is one of my favorite places on earth, and the Gurkhas have a quite astounding, well-deserved reputation around the world. Isn't it wonderful to consider that this is one of the genuine Gurkha cookeries that they use with such aplomb and distinction in military campaigns and in their everyday life. But the story I want to share today is really a little about the Battle of Colenso that took place on the 15th of December of 1899. Colenso is just south of the town of Ladysmith. You will recall that Ladysmith was besieged on the 1st of November of 1899 after the Battle of Ladysmith, where the Boers proved irrevocably that they were far better fighting men on horseback out in the open veldt than the British were. And with this, the town of Ladysmith was besieged. So we need to go back just a little, if we may. During the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, a remarkable officer called Redvers, who hailed from Crediton in Devon, had earned a Victoria Cross at the Battle of Colenso on the 28th of March of 1879. Buller had by this time forged a pretty firm friendship with a man called Piet Uys, who was a Dutchman, a Boer. Piet Uys was fighting with the British against the Zulus. And do you know that the night before that battle, Uys and Buller had sat around a fire, I think both having a premonition that something was going to go wrong. And they promised one another that if one of them were killed, the surviving would take care of the deceased family for the rest of his life. Well, in the Battle of Colenso, Piet Uys and 2 of his sons were killed at the Devil's Pass, where Buller earned his Victoria Cross. Do you know that Buller sent food parcels and money to the Uys family to the day he died? Such was the bond between those men. And Buller identified that the Boers were God-fearing people who lived close to the earth, close to their family, close to their farms. He always maintained that it would be a travesty and a crying shame if the British ever had to fight them, because the only way to defeat them would be to destroy their supply chains, destroy their reserves and supply depots, as in their farms, put their aged women and children in internment camps. This is before the term of concentration camp came about, and literally divide the country up into camps and drive the men on horseback, the Boers, into corners like you would a rabbit on a drive. Buller was violently opposed to the Anglo-Boer War. Buller too was a man who I feel was a great chief executive officer. Your greatest player does not necessarily always make your greatest captain. And I think Buller performed with distinction, with Wood making the decisions and Buller carrying them out. I don't think that Buller really ever had illusions or ideas of being a general. And he was sent out as a great star in the British Army, a man who by this time had gone to seed somewhat, a little overweight, 59 years of age. He had enjoyed food and drink, particularly champagne, all his life, and a man who was no longer the great officer and soldier that he'd been during the Anglo-Zulu War 20 years earlier. And Buller had said to men like White and Penn-Symons not to go north of the Tugela River. The river, you recall, the biggest in Natal, the startling one. The country to the north of the Tugela River changes considerably. It becomes far more rocky, broken and steep. And Buller knew that if these garrisons were besieged by the Boers north of the Tugela River, it would be an extremely exacting, difficult task to relieve the sieges. And whilst he was coming out with the British reinforcements, 47,000 in number, the greatest force of men to ever leave British shores, White had gone north of the Tugela, as had Penn-Symons. Penn-Symons was defeated in the Battle of Tulana, and the Boers eventually pushed the British out of the town of Dundee to retreat onto Ladysmith under their officer who relieved Penn-Symons upon his death, called Ewell. White, General Charles White, had gone north of the Tugela into Ladysmith. He had been smashed up by the Boers in the Battle of Ladysmith on the 30th of October. I've already mentioned that a number of times. And Buller eventually would arrive at escort and move his force out to the town of Freer, which is next to the railway line, on the way up to Ladysmith, where Churchill was captured on the armoured train. And Buller wanted, with the difficulties of the terrain and the geography of the hills north of the Tugela, Louis Botha, that remarkable 37-year-old prodigy who'd only taken over after the fall of Piet Joubert off his horse. Piet Joubert was badly injured. He'd fallen off his horse crossing a stream. He ended up with multiple internal injuries from which he eventually died. And this catapulted Louis Botha to become the commandant, the main Boer general on what became known as the Tugela Line. And with him north of the Tugela, trying to prevent the British crossing the Tugela, and Buller south of the Tugela, these two men were effectively playing chess. Now, it's easy for us in hindsight to judge and ascertain what the other was doing. At the time, the motives and the intentions of the other were as foreign to the opposition as anything could be. Botha had to imagine what Buller was planning, and Buller in turn was trying to imagine what Botha was intending to do to stop the British crossing the Tugela. And Buller's plan was to move off westwards from Freer with a huge force of men towards Springfontein, it's now called Winterton, cross the Tugela and roll up the Boer defences from the flank, and in so doing open the road through to Ladysmith. But as fate would have it, the Boers, after their success in the First Transvaal War of Independence, where they'd given the British a regular bloody nose 4 in succession and been granted their independence, they figured that if they gave the British a number of bloody noses again, they could indeed insist on peace and the British would withdraw. So there were a number of actions. Koos de la Rey, the line of the West, was very active down in the Cape, where the Boers had besieged the towns of Mafeking and Kimberley, and de la Rey had changed the rules. Instead of entrenching and occupying the high ground, he had set up his trenches down at the base of the koppies on the low ground. And in a battle known as Margesfontein, along with the Battle of Stormberg and Modder River, the British suffered incredible reverses at the hands of de la Rey's men. And with news in what became known as Black Week reaching Britain, the British media and the British public were screaming for action to come from Buller. And Buller decided now, being hard-pressed in a war he never believed in a war he never wanted, against opposition he treated with great respect and reverence, that he was going to try and force the main road and rail bridge across the Tugela at Colenso and go straight up the road and railway line into Ladysmith in a direct frontal attack. Well, Botha, 37-year-old Botha, a man who'd only gone to the school to the age of 12, would indeed gangplank local African labour to dig a huge number of dummy positions in the koppies, the hills to the north of the Tugela at Colenso. Some were even beautifully disguised with rocks to look like gun positions. They cut big branches out of trees to make them look like a gun up on the high ground, but the real trenches had been placed very cleverly, a la de la Rey, in the reed beds all the way along the Tugela River. And in the vicinity of Colenso, just to the west of Colenso, there's a mighty salient, a huge loop in the Tugela, where if the Boers entrenched themselves cleverly, as they did, they could fire upon the British in that salient from 3 sides. Well, on the 15th of December of 1899, Buller, with a huge force of men, would literally attack the road and the rail bridge at Colenso. Fitzroy Hart, General Fitzroy Hart, known as No Bobs, would lead the Irish Brigade on the left-hand side of the position. Then there'd be Hilliard and Barton, and Long with the artillery guns was told to move forward towards the town of Colenso and a kopje, a hill on the southern side of the Tugela called Llangwan. Well, Long, in an action that has been questioned ever since, took the guns too far forward. Long had disobeyed Buller, who'd shown on a blueprint map exactly where he was to stop and prepare his guns for action. Fitzroy Hart, taking their advice and the leadership of a native guide, the guide led them, instead of to the bridle drift, led them to a drift in that blind salient, the loop of the Tugela. Well, Botha really wanted the British to cross the river. He had taken the precaution of dynamiting the rail bridge, so it was disused and now badly broken, blown up, lying in the water of the Tugela, and he had actually put charges on the road bridge, that if they needed to, they could blow the road bridge and prevent the British crossing the river on the road bridge. But he was going to do his best to hold the road bridge, knowing that it was important to communication across the mighty Tugela River. Botha wanted the British to cross the river before he fired with a 4.5-inch howitzer the first shot, for the British to be trapped with the river at their back, and the Boer success then would be absolutely complete. Well, with Long taking the guns too far forward down towards Llangwan and the Tugela River, for the Boers the excitement was too much. They would open fire upon Long before Botha had a chance to fire the howitzer. Hart, with the Irish Brigade, has marched into this blind salient of the Tugela and was fired upon from 3 sides. Buller was watching in horror from a little ridge of high ground called Clouston. Great place to visit today, and we always do on our tours to the battlefield of Colenso. Well, the Boer fire effectively nullified Long's guns immediately. 12 guns with Long. With Long was a lieutenant called Freddie Roberts, Field Marshal Roberts' only son, who was mortally wounded. The casualties began to escalate. Roberts and others were trying to save the guns. They would eventually have to abandon 10 of the 12 guns, along with their limbers and their ammunition wagons, horses being shot dead. Hart had to try and extract himself from the blind salient of the Tugela. Buller rode forward on his horse all the way down to Long's position, horrified, having seen through his telescope how far forward Long had gone, and ordered the battle to be abandoned, that everyone should withdraw from their positions. It had begun early in the morning, and by midday it was all over. Would you believe the Battle of Colenso saw 1,193 casualties on the British side? Buller had to retire to his headquarters at Freer, and he fired off 2 telegrams. I bet he regretted to the day he died. The first was to White in the siege of Ladysmith, saying that it was too difficult to try and break the siege. White should negotiate for the best terms he could and surrender. Now, for a senior officer to be giving a man in a siege position like this permission effectively to negotiate terms and surrender to the Boers was completely unheard of. He also sent off a telegram to the War Office saying that he figured he was not strong enough to relieve the siege of Ladysmith, and that they should send out a stronger officer to do so, which was for Buller a major indication for us of what his self-confidence had suffered that day. Do you know the following day he had to send off a telegram to his arch rival, bearing in mind that Buller came from the African ring and Field Marshal Roberts came from the Indian ring. Arch rivals, arch enemies. He he had to send off a telegram to Field Marshal Roberts saying, "Your gallant son died today. Condolences, Buller." Well, Buller would be replaced indeed by Field Marshal Roberts, who came out to South Africa. This war that had begun on the 11th of October of 1899 and the British hoped would be over by Christmas time of that year was clearly not over, and was about to enter a completely different phase of the war once the sieges of Mafeking, Kimberley and Ladysmith had been relieved. It's a fascinating military saga, and I hope you'll continue with me on this journey. Thank you very much.